Section 20 of Schopenhauer's Counsels and Maxims is the final section of Chapter 2 on our relation to ourselves. I think you'll find that it starts out a little bit odd with a discussion of physical exercise, but it finishes strong. I think you'll really enjoy it. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. In the first part of this work, I have insisted upon the great value of health as the chief and most important element in happiness. Let me emphasize and confirm what I have there said by giving a few general rules as to its preservation. The way to harden the body is to impose a great deal of labor and effort upon it in the days of good health, to exercise it both as a whole and in its several parts, and to habituate it to withstand all kinds of noxious influences. But on the appearance of any illness or disorder, either in the body as a whole or in any of its parts, a contrary course should be taken, and every means used to nurse the body, or the part of it which is affected, and to spare it any effort, for what is ailing and debilitated cannot be hardened. The muscles may be strengthened by a vigorous use of them, but not so the nerves. They are weakened by it. Therefore, while exercising the muscles in every way that is suitable, care should be taken to spare the nerves as much as possible. The eyes, for instance, should be protected from too strong a light, especially when it is reflected light, from any straining of them in the dark, and from the long-continued examination of minute objects, and the ears from too loud sounds. Above all, the brain should never be forced or used too much or at the wrong time. Let it have a rest during digestion, for then the same vital energy which forms thoughts in the brain has a great deal of work to do elsewhere. I mean, in the digestive organs, where it prepares chyme and chyle. For similar reasons, the brain should never be used during or immediately after violent muscular exercise. For the motor nerves are, in this respect, on a par with the sensory nerves. The pain felt when a limb is wounded has its seat in the brain. And in the same way, it is not really our legs and arms which work and move. It is the brain, or more strictly, that part of it which, through the medium of the spine, excites the nerves in the limbs and sets them in motion. Accordingly, when our arms and legs feel tired, the true seat of this feeling is in the brain. This is why it is only in connection with those muscles which are set in motion consciously and voluntarily, in other words, depend for their action upon the brain, that any feeling of fatigue can arise. This is not the case with those muscles which work involuntarily, like the heart. It is obvious then that injury is done to the brain if violent muscular exercise and intellectual exertion are forced upon it at the same moment, or at very short intervals. I'll pause here about halfway through section 20 to just post a little bit of incredulity. I'm not certain that this advice holds up, although it is very revealing of Schopenhauer's attitude towards a practical philosophy, something that unites an account of the body, the brain, the mind, as we'll see in what follows. Back to Schopenhauer. What I say stands in no contradiction with the fact that at the beginning of a walk, or at any period of a short stroll, there often comes a feeling of enhanced intellectual vigor. The parts of the brain that come into play have had no time to become tired. And besides, slight muscular exercise conduces to activity of the respiratory organs and causes a purer and more oxidated supply of arterial blood to mount to the brain. It is most important to allow the brain the full measure of sleep which is necessary to restore it. For sleep is to a man's whole nature what winding up is to a clock. This measure will vary directly with the development and activity of the brain. To overstep the measure is mere waste of time, because if that is done, sleep gains only so much in length as it loses in depth. And here Schopenhauer adds an interesting footnote, which I'll read to you. Here's the footnote. Sleep is a morsel of death borrowed to keep up and renew the part of life which is exhausted by the day. Le sommeil est un emprunt fait à la mort. Or it might be said that sleep is the interest we have to pay on the capital which is called in at death. And the higher the rate of interest and the more regularly it is paid, the further the date of redemption is postponed. Okay, I have to say, I love that footnote, the image of sleep as interest we pay on the capital of our lives. The more we pay as we go along, the more we sleep, the longer we can postpone the redemption date of our death. Contrariwise, the less we sleep, the more we economize on sleep here, the less interest we're paying, the sooner the loan will be called in. Our death arrives more quickly. I think that's a great image, regardless whether we agree with the practical advice or not. Back to the main text of Schopenhauer. It should be clearly understood that thought is nothing but the organic function of the brain, and it has to obey the same laws in regard to exertion and repose as any other organic function. The brain can be ruined by overstrain, just like the eyes. As the function of the stomach is to digest, so it is that of the brain to think. The notion of a soul as something elementary and immaterial, merely lodging in the brain and needing nothing at all for the performance of its essential function, which consists in always and unweariedly thinking, has undoubtedly driven many people to foolish practices, leading to a deadening of the intellectual powers. Frederick the Great even once tried to form the habit of doing without sleep altogether. It would be well if professors of philosophy refrained from giving currency to a notion which is attended by practical results of a pernicious character. But then this is just what professorial philosophy does, in its old womanish endeavor to keep on good terms with the catechism. A man should accustom himself to view his intellectual capacities in no other light than that of physiological functions, and to manage them accordingly, nursing or exercising them as the case may be, remembering that every kind of physical suffering, malady, or disorder, in whatever part of the body it occurs, has its effect upon the mind. The best advice I know on this subject is given by Cabanis in his Rapport du physique et du moral de l'homme. Through neglect of this rule, many men of genius and great scholars have become weak-minded and childish, or even gone quite mad as they grew old. To take no other instances, there can be no doubt that the celebrated English poets of the early part of this century, Scott, Wordsworth, Southey, became intellectually dull and incapable towards the end of their days, nay, soon after passing their 60th year, and that their imbecility can be traced to the fact that, at that period of life, they were all led on by the promise of high pay to treat literature as a trade and to write for money. This seduced them into an unnatural abuse of their intellectual powers, and a man who puts his Pegasus into harness and urges on his muse with the whip will have to pay a penalty similar to that which is exacted by the abuse of other kinds of power. And even in the case of Kant, I suspect that the second childhood of his last 4 years was due to overwork in later life, and after he had succeeded in becoming a famous man. Every month of the year has its own peculiar and direct influence upon health and bodily condition generally, nay, even upon the state of the mind. It is an influence dependent upon the weather. That's the end of section 20 and the end of chapter 2 of Counsels and Maxims. I think some real Schopenhauerian style here, first with the condemnation of the sort of Cartesian idea of the ghost in the machine, the soul that somehow is not physiological and so doesn't depend upon the body. Schopenhauer insisting, here I think correctly, that everything in the body affects the mind, and the mind required. The brain certainly requires a certain amount of care as a bodily organ. And then this fantastic snarling at the professors of philosophy, encouraging a notion which is attended by practical results of a pernicious character. Okay, we would please beg the philosophers of our time to stop ruining people's lives, Schopenhauer says. So I think this has been an interesting conclusion to this chapter on our relation to ourselves. We'll break into section 21 and the next chapter on our relation to others in another video. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.